you very much for your kind introduction. Dr. Chandlu, Dr. Ansari, Mr. Mujumdar, Dr. Qasim, I'm so sorry. Dr. Chandlu, Dr. Qasim. It's not easy to remember all these names with which one is confronted. I'm very honored to be with you today because the Kolkata Port Trust is an institution which enjoys a great reputation. I grew up in this city and I have known about Port Trust since my school days. So it's a great honor and a great distinction for me to participate in the celebration of your anniversary. I recognize that we are running a little late, but I will try to be disciplined in my use of time and see that we make up for some of the time that we lost by beginning a little later than scheduled. When I was asked to deliver this anniversary lecture, I was a little perplexed because I wasn't quite sure that I was the right person to give a lecture to an audience of this kind. And so what I did was to ask for time. I said, well, I don't think I'll be able to give it this year, but perhaps next year, hoping that the authorities of the Port Trust would forget all about me, but they didn't. They came back to me, and so here I am with you. I also gave some thought to the choice of a subject for this morning's lecture. It would be completely beyond my ability to talk to you about the Constitution and the reform of the Port Trust, about which I know very little. So I thought that I would choose a topic which might be of some interest to a more general public. And I decided to talk to you about caste today, its present significance in Indian society. Now, as was indicated in my introduction, I have in fact written books on caste. In the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, caste was a subject of academic interest, not necessarily a subject of very wide public interest. Today, I think it has become a subject of public interest. And I would like to give some thought as to how this has happened. How a subject whose study was confined to a rather specialized group of academics in the fields of social anthropology and sociology has now captured the public imagination. How has this happened, and what does this indicate about the changes in our society and the changes in our perception of where Indian society is moving? Now, I realize that India is a very large country with a tremendous amount of diversity. If I were speaking to an audience of this kind, let's say in Bangalore or in Patna or even in Delhi, I don't think that I would need to spend too much time to justify the choice of the topic or the subject of caste. But about Kolkata, I'm not absolutely sure whether the enlightened public in Kolkata spends all that much time talking about caste, discussing caste, and its various implications. As a student of society, I've been struck very much by the change in perceptions that has come about, particularly since 1977. I think 1977 was a kind of watershed in the public attention that began to be paid increasingly to caste and its operation in public life. Today, it is a subject which receives an enormous amount of attention from the media, both print and electronic. And if you go back to the newspapers of the 50s and 60s and even the 70s, you will not find caste receiving the kind of attention that it receives in the newspapers, in the popular magazines, and particularly on television. People talk endlessly about, for instance, caste bias in education and employment. And this has caught the attention of people. It has become a source of increasing debate as to how far does caste bias prevail in the admission of students or in the appointment of faculty in our universities and in our centers of advanced study. How far are institutions like the Indian Institute of Technology or the All India Institute of Medical Sciences, to what extent are admissions and appointments there governed by caste bias? To what extent is the operation of everyday activities in a place like the All India Institute of Medical Sciences governed by caste considerations? How far does caste enter into the actual operation of what goes on in the Indian Institutes of Technology, in Jawaharlal Nehru University, in the University of Delhi? And when I go back to my own experience of the University of Delhi, the Delhi School of Economics, and the University of Delhi in general, to which I came as a young lecturer in 1959, the subject of caste was considered rather boring, particularly by my colleagues in the Department of Economics, who believed that caste belonged to India's past, not to India's future. And when one talked about caste with these people, they felt that this was a subject of highly specialized interest with which intelligent people who are concerned with the transformation of Indian society should not preoccupy themselves too much. I've had many discussions and many arguments with my colleagues in the Delhi School of Economics going back to the late 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. Today, it's very widely discussed in the University of Delhi. I spent 5 years in Delhi in one of the premier halls of residence, in fact the oldest hall of residence called Wire Hall. And there, people did not really bother very much about caste unless they happened to be anthropologists or sociologists. But today, if you go to Wire Hall in Delhi University and ask about admissions, and whether admissions are transparent or whether they are fixed, within 5 minutes, you will come to the point when people tell you all of this is in fact done in terms of caste. Caste is very important in the operation of our public institutions, whether in education or in employment. I don't know to what extent this is actually true. My sense is that that caste bias certainly exists, even in our premier institutions, public institutions, but my sense is that this tends to be somewhat exaggerated by the media. But we should not shut our eyes to the existence of caste bias in our public institutions, whether in regard to education or in regard to employment. Then the media are full of reports about caste conflicts, including violent conflicts, in the villages, in the towns, and sometimes even in the cities. Now, as I said, India is a very large country, and you may not hear reports about caste conflicts equally from all parts of the country, but there are many parts of the country where, in fact, these conflicts are reported in the daily press. Now, it might happen that caste conflicts prevailed even in the past, but they were not reported as actively in the press as happens to be done now. That is possible, but that is certainly there. Then again, when one is talking about electoral politics in most parts of India, the caste equation figures very much in electoral calculations. So this is what keeps the subject of caste alive in our media and in public debate and in public discussion. And I do want to emphasize that something has changed. It may not have changed in all parts of the country, something has changed in our public discourse, and we should take note of this change. Whether this change in fact reflects a hardening of caste or a strengthening of caste is a separate question to which I will devote most of my talk this morning. But certainly the perception that caste is important has become much more widespread among the intelligentsia, among academics, among journalists, among people who write about public affairs. Certainly that is the case. And I have found myself in a rather odd position as a social anthropologist who began by taking an academic interest in caste and was derided by some of my progressive friends, particularly in the profession of economics, for taking so much interest in what they considered to be a reactionary subject, because their feeling was in the 50s and 60s that if you are interested in the roots of inequality and the roots of conflict in Indian society, then you should look to class and not to caste. But the same people who tended to dismiss caste as an epiphenomenon, as a matter of the superstructure, rather than as being at the heart of inequality and conflict in Indian society, have now turned with new eyes and tend to put caste in the center of attention. Now, certainly, if one goes by what one reads in the media or what one sees on television, one will have to admit that caste is still very much here. And this is very different. This perception of Indian society is very different from the perception that forward-looking and progressive Indians had in the wake of independence. Certainly they believed in Nehru's India that caste was on its way out. Rather than becoming stronger and stronger, caste was on its way out. And I remember in 1957, it's not that everybody subscribed to the general optimism that caste was on its way out, that caste would soon be a thing of the past. There were exceptions, and I will draw attention to one of those exceptions, whose writings, even in the 50s, drew attention to the fact that caste was very much a part of the Indian reality in post-independence India. And this point was made very forcefully by a person who dominated sociological studies in India in the second half of the 20th century. This is M.N. Srinivas. M.N. Srinivas, in his presidential address to the Anthropology and Archaeology section of the Indian Science Congress here in the city of Calcutta in 1957, argued that we have not seen the last of the caste system, that it was still alive and kicking and we better take note of it. And I remember that there was an editorial in the Times of India commenting on that presidential address, which was given in December 1957. So early on, there was an editorial saying that, this is very greatly exaggerated. This is something which is dying out, and this eminent social anthropologist or sociologist wants to bring it back to life. And I remember the response to Srinivas's views in the Indian Statistical Institute, where I had my first job. People tended to deride this preoccupation with caste. Similarly, when I talked to economists in the Delhi School of Economics, to which I moved in 1959, the economists with whom one discussed these issues, whether it was K.N. Raj or P.N. Dar or V.N. Bandekar, they were inclined to argue that this is not something which we should worry too much about, that this is on its way out, and we should not pay too much attention to it. Now the question that I want to ask myself is, were these distinguished economists, academics, journalists who believed that caste was in decline, were they completely deluded? Was this a complete delusion? Were they unable to see what was going on in Indian society? Were they completely blind to what was going on in Indian society and said that caste was on its way out, where, as a matter of fact, it was very much a part of the Indian reality? Frankly, I don't think so. I don't think that they were wholly deluded, and I'll explain why I don't think that they were wholly deluded. Because there are many areas of social life in this country in which there is a secular trend of decline in the significance of caste. And I would like to say a few things about this secular trend of decline in many areas of our social life. And again, I'll pick out three areas. One can talk about many other areas. I'll pick out three areas and argue that there is substantial evidence that caste is in decline in all these three areas, in all these three fields of social life or social action. Although, of course, this decline is not uniform across all the regions of the country, not at all. But nevertheless, if you take India as a whole, the pace of the decline may be slower in some areas, faster in other areas. The evidence may be more clear from some areas than from others. But I think overall, one will have to concede that the evidence shows that caste has been steadily in decline in three of the most significant areas of social life where it held a position of very great importance until the end of the 19th century. And I will pick out three areas and run through these three areas very quickly before I come back to the question with which I started. Why has it become a subject of such great public attention if it is a fact that it is in decline in all the areas which were considered important to caste at the end of the 19th century and even at the time of independence? So what are the three areas that I would like to consider, or from which I would like to consider evidence? First is the area of religion and ritual. Second is the area of intermarriage. And third is the area of the association between caste and occupation. Today, when people talk about the increasing strength of caste in public life, they are not talking about the increasing hold of caste rituals over the social lives of Indians, even in the rural areas. Maybe caste continues to have a certain hold in rituals in the rural areas, but I have not found any argument or any evidence which says that the ritual aspects of caste are becoming stronger even in the rural areas. They may say that they're still very much there, they haven't weakened very much, but nobody, as far as I know, no sociologist or social anthropologist or student of rural society has argued that the ritual aspects of caste are becoming reinforced. They're not saying that. Yet, if you look at the literature on caste till the time of independence, much of that literature, in fact, highlights the importance of ritual, particularly the ritual opposition of purity and pollution as the basis of the divisions and hierarchies of caste. And this, particularly the writings of civil servants and missionaries, but also a large number of Indians writing about caste, drew attention to the great strength of the opposition of purity and pollution as a basis for the hierarchies of caste. And particularly in the writings of colonial civil servants, whether you take Blunt or J.H. Hutton, page after page of description of the details of ritual life and ritual hierarchies which kept the caste system intact. For instance, the rules for the interchange of food and water. What kind of food is acceptable from whom? from which caste is water acceptable to the upper caste? I mean, there is enormous regional variation in this. For instance, in Eastern India, including Bengal, one test of the hierarchy of caste is from whose hands the upper castes accept water. And castes are classified in terms of whether the water is acceptable from them by the Brahmins, the Kaistas, and the Vaidus. That's one of the major tests. And accounts of the caste system dwell on this aspect of it in great detail. Now again, I mean, this is not something which was conjured up by one or two anthropologists with a strong imagination, although I must say that some of the discussions of the ritual restrictions on caste seem so exaggerated as to be not altogether plausible. For instance, there are detailed accounts, particularly from South India, about the distances that various castes had to, the physical distances that they had to maintain from each other depending on their ritual status in the hierarchy. A Nair could approach within 16 feet of the Nambudris, and the Tia could approach within 64 feet, and Pulaya could approach, could not approach beyond 128 feet. And these are stereotyped accounts of what people thought was the structure. But they gave a good idea of what people considered to be the basis for the maintenance of social distance and social exclusion in Indian society up to the 1940s and the 1950s. So the ritual basis for social relation, the ritual basis for social inclusion and social exclusion, which was such a very important aspect of the caste system. I don't think that there is any doubt that this has been weakening steadily. There is a secular trend of decline in the ritual basis of caste. And indeed, many of the practices which were considered orthodox and necessary for the maintenance of the caste system began to appear not only obsolete, but even ridiculous. As you go, I had a friend in college, in St. Xavier's College, who was the best student in my class, and he came from Bhatpara, and they were Vedic Brahmins. And he used to tell me that his father's great ambition was to be an engineer. But he could not be an engineer because in those days, in order to be an engineer, you had to study in BE College and you had to live in the hostel of BE College, and his grandparents, all the family would not allow my friend's father to do that. So he had to come to Presidency College by train and go back home, bring his own water and his own food. Now this kind of practice was already appearing ridiculous in the 30s and 40s and 50s. But this was a very important basis which kept the system together, maintained its gradations, maintained its practices of inclusion and exclusion. The practice of untouchability, that continues. I won't say that it has disappeared, but I would say that the ritual aspects of the practice of untouchability are no longer as prominent. That doesn't necessarily mean that everything is positive, because as I put it, the practice of untouchability in the traditional ritual sense of the term is being replaced by the practice of atrocities against the untouchable. That's a very different kind of thing. The practice of atrocities about which you read in the newspapers, and they are practiced against the Dalits in many parts of the country, that's a very different thing from the practice of social exclusion through the operation of ritual rules. I've seen this change with my own eyes in a village in Tanjore district, which is the citadel of Brahminical orthodoxy, where I lived in a village. In the Brahmin quarters of the village, which is known as the Agraharam, I found my way into the Agraharam. How I managed to do that is a different story. And I used to be there, and in the evenings, there is clear residential segregation in these villages, or there was. I'm talking now about 1961-62 when I lived in the village. clear residential segregation. There is a part of the village which is known as the Agraharam. That is the part of the village in which only Brahmins lived. Until then, no non-Brahmin lived there. At the other extreme, you had what is called the Cheri. And the Cheri is where the Dalits or the Adi Dravidas or the Harijans lived. In between, you had the non-Brahmin streets. Now, I lived in one of the Brahmin houses, and in the evenings, occasionally, I would hear someone shouting, Swami, Swami. Swami is the standard term of address for a Brahmin. Any Brahmin is called a Swami. And you can identify a Brahmin in the rural areas, or you could. 40 or 45 years ago, you could identify a Brahmin just by his appearance, by how he dressed, and so on. Swami. And I used to wonder, who is calling whom? And I decided to investigate. And I was told that it is the Harijan tenant or sharecropper who has come to deliver the grain to his landlord. And he cannot enter the Brahmin street. So he has to come through the back door. And the back door is often shut. So he shouts so that somebody can go and open the back door so that he can deposit the grain and go away. And I thought that this was all extremely interesting. I must say, my view of it at that time at least was not that of the moralist, but that of the sociologist. I wanted to understand what is the logic of this system. I thought all of this was very interesting, but what really struck me as interesting, even more interesting, was the fact that after the school was over every day, the children would rush through the Agraharam because the school was at the bottom of the Agraharam. And then I decided to investigate as to whether there were any Harijan children in the Agraharam. And of course there were. Of course there were Harijan children in the Agraharam. But their fathers, their elders, would not venture to pass through the Agraharam. It's not simply that they would be penalized, they would be punished if they did it, but they would not do it. This was not how they were socialized. This was not how they viewed the world. And I had a Brahmin friend. Who was a landlord, who was an educated man. And we used to talk about all kinds of things. And we used to go out to a nearby town. It was just an adjacent small town, an overgrown village. And we would have a cup of coffee and sit on, it's called a payar, what the Bengalis call rock. We would sit there, anybody's house, and have coffee. And my landlord, my friend, who was an Aiga Brahmin, he had a cow of which he was very fond. And there was a special kind of leaf called atikeri, which he liked to feed his cow from time to time. So when he sat there, he would see someone from the village, anybody's servant, but again, one would identify a Dalit by his appearance. He would see this person, he would call him, anybody, and throw some money to him, 10 paise or something like that, to ask him to buy some atikeri and deliver it at the back door. And he always threw the coin at this man. And since my friend was an educated man and an enlightened man, although I had gone there in a spirit of detachment, one day I told him, I said, why do you do this? Can't you give him the money? Why do you throw it at him? He picks it up from the road. He laughed at me. He said, I see. Well, I'll give you the money. Tomorrow you give it to him. Well, I was identified as a Brahmin by my appearance, by my company, by how I looked, and how I... So you give him the money. And that's what I tried to do. I called the man and I held out the money and he just stepped back. He wouldn't take the money from my hand. All of this has changed. And this, I believe, is also an important change. And this change is a secular trend of change. I have no doubt whatsoever that this, what was once considered to be absolutely crucial to the functioning of the caste system, is now in complete or almost complete disarray. Not so much in the rural areas. Today, there are Orthodox persons throughout North India and South India who would think 5 times before employing a Harijan woman as a cook, or even before allowing her to use the kitchen. But I think that the trend of change is quite clear. The direction of change is quite clear. Let me now turn to another very important area. Very, very important area. You know, if you look at the older literature on caste, there are three areas on which various anthropologists and sociologists concentrated, focused their attention. One was this ritual opposition of purity and pollution. The second was marriage. And they said that the real heart of the caste system lay in its marriage rules and restrictions on marriage. And of course, they were very extensive, and they were very elaborate. I won't say that the rules of caste endogamy have disappeared. I think that marriage is one area in which people look to match caste with caste. I think so. I've known lots of very liberal, highly educated, even left-oriented intellectuals who say that caste doesn't exist in Indian society anymore, but are quite aware when they are looking for a bride or a groom, they're quite aware of the caste of the person. But while that is there are also changes. I'm not saying that this has disappeared, there are also changes. And I will draw attention to two or three kinds of changes. One is that the rules of the restrictions on marriage, or the rules of marriage within the caste system, were not simple. They were quite elaborate and quite complex. We tend to think of the rules of caste marriage only in terms of the rules of endogamy, that you marry within your own caste. But that was not the only rule that prevailed. There was also the rule of hypergamy. And that was some anthropologists have argued that the rule of hypergamy, which in Sanskrit is known as anuloma, that is, a man of a superior caste may marry not only a woman of his own caste, but some women of some lower caste, never the other way around. Anuloma, but never pratiloma. Anuloma is sanctioned, anuloma is considered to be necessary, it's quite all right, but not pratiloma. And rules of hypergamy were very widely practiced. The Kuri Brahmins, to which community my maternal ancestors belonged, Kuri Brahmins were notorious for the practice of anuloma. And that enabled their men, in fact, to accumulate large numbers of wives, and along with that, they could also accumulate large sums in dowry. Now, intercaste marriages do take place, and I will explain in what way. But when intercaste marriages do take place, the point I'm trying to make is that intercaste marriages did take place even in the past, but according to certain very specific rules. The man had to be of the superior caste and the woman of the inferior caste. Today, when intercaste marriages take place, when that is allowed, when that is tolerated, people no longer want to find out whether it is anuloma or pratiloma. An intercaste marriage today is an intercaste marriage. And I have tested this with my own students in Delhi University, students from this city, from Calcutta. And I've sort of asked them, these are mainly upper caste Brahmin girls, and I would ask them from time to time, তোমাদের বাড়িতে অনুলোম বিয়ে হয়েছে, প্রতিলোম বিয়ে হয়েছে? And they don't know the meanings of these words. These words have lost their meaning and their significance. And I think that that is not unimportant. Are intercaste marriages taking place? Yes. But how widespread are they? I don't really know. We don't have reliable or adequate statistics to tell us how widespread intercaste marriages are. But intercaste marriages are taking place. However, even when intercaste marriages do take place, one has to recognize the fact that these marriages are usually between adjacent subcastes of the same caste. Let's say a marriage between a Rani bride and a Barendro groom, which would be considered improper, unacceptable in my grandmother's generation, totally unacceptable. Today, it's a marriage. It's a marriage within the Brahmin community. Intercaste marriages are also acceptable provided the distance between the two castes is not very great, let's say between Brahman and Betaille or Caste. That kind of thing is much more widespread now than was the case before. We have very scattered evidence about its prevalence, but the trend nevertheless is quite clear, that the rules restricting intermarriage are not becoming more stringent, they are becoming more lax. But one must not ignore the fact that if an intercaste marriage is between, let's say, an upper caste woman and a Dalit man, then sanctions are likely to be very swift. If it is between another, because there is a strong bias for anuloma in the caste system and a strong bias against pratiloma in the caste system. I think that's very deep in the structure of Indian society. It's not just a matter of caste. The idea that the status of the groom should be superior to the status of the bride is very, very strongly held in, and it goes very deep in Indian society. So intercaste marriages are taking place, but not necessarily across great structural distances. But the other important thing is, and this is certainly to be taken note of, is not simply the frequency of intercaste marriages. One might say that 1 in 1,000, but even that it would be quite something compared to the past. It's not just the frequency that one has to take into account, it's the sanctions against intercaste marriages that have to be taken into account. Because one must ask, even if there are 3 intercaste marriages, what is the consequence? What is the sanction against an intercaste marriage? There are very powerful sanctions of the community against intercaste marriages in the past. These community sanctions have ceased to exist. Whatever sanctions there are sanctions within the family or the joint family at the most. So that again is an important change. The third area in which the association between caste, where caste seems to be weakening, and again where there is a secular trend, is in the association between caste and occupation. Whereas there are those anthropologists, earlier anthropologists, who believed that the heart of the caste system lay in the ritual opposition of purity and pollution. And those anthropologists who believed that the heart of the caste system lay in the rules of intermarriage, there were other anthropologists and sociologists who argued that the real foundation of the caste system lay in the association between caste and occupation. I would say that there is still some association between caste and occupation, but it is weakening. If one wants to understand what is the association between caste and occupation, I think one has to examine it at 2 different levels. First of all, there was a very specific association between caste and occupation of the kind which was studied in very great detail by my own teacher, the late Professor Nirmal Kumar Bose. For instance, he pointed out that among oil presses, ladies, there are 2 or 3 different subcastes of ladies. And each subcaste practices oil pressing in using its own particular techniques. There are the oil pressers who use 1 bullock for running the oil mill, and there are oil pressers who use 2 bullocks for running the oil mill. Similarly for potters, similarly for other occupations. It's a kind of monopoly which goes down right to the details of the craft or the service. Now that kind of specific association between caste and occupation is very definitely in retreat, because many of these old occupations are now dying out, or many of the old techniques or the old crafts are now dying out. But apart from the specific association between caste and occupation, that is, a subcaste pursuing a particular craft in a particular manner, there is also a general association between caste and occupation. That is, castes belonging to the higher levels usually practice superior non-manual occupations, and castes belonging to the lower levels usually were relegated to the inferior manual and menial occupations, and that association is still quite noticeable. It hasn't disappeared, although it has been shaken up, it hasn't quite disappeared. One important factor behind the loosening of the association between caste and occupation is the emergence of a very large number of new caste-free occupations, There are new occupations to which there is no appropriate caste or subcaste. There are no particular castes or subcastes which match the new occupations that are emerging before our eyes at a very rapid rate. So that is another factor which leads to the weakening of the association between caste and occupation. So, I've been arguing that in three very important areas, caste does seem to be in retreat, so that my economist friends in the Delhi School of Economics, like K.M. Raj or Amartya Sen or Sharecropper, when they were saying that caste is in decline, it is not altogether an illusion that it was in decline in that sense. And but then why do people say, why have people acquired a renewed interest in caste? I would say, in conclusion, and this is the last point I want to make, if caste has been given a new lease of life in Indian society, it is the political system which has given caste a new lease of life. And Srinivas makes this point very. Srinivas's name was long associated with the idea that caste is still very strong and is growing stronger. And this paper, Caste in Modern India, which was read as the presidential address at the Indian Science Congress, this paper is regarded as a landmark in the argument for the continued existence of caste, or even for the strengthening of caste. I have read, it's a very outstanding paper. I have read that paper many times, and it has many examples. But every single example that Srinivas uses for arguing that caste is becoming stronger is an example from politics. There's not a single example from all the three areas that I have just discussed. And these were the three areas which seemed to Srinivas's predecessors, people who were writing about caste, these seem to be the areas which constituted the real source and the real strength of caste. There's no doubt at all that caste, democratic politics, we all love democracy, but we must also recognize the fact that there is no way in which we can deny the fact that democratic politics has given a new lease of life to caste by allowing caste to be used as a basis for mobilizing electoral support. And this is not confined to, it's a very large subject in itself. This is a worldwide phenomenon. This is what is described as identity politics. It is not only caste. It can be religion, it can be language, it can be ethnicity. I mean, throughout Eastern Europe and Central Europe, you see the resurgence of identity politics. So in that sense, caste has been given a new lease of life by democracy. And Srinivas was right, and so was K.N. Raj right. When K.N. Raj was arguing that caste is weakening, he had in mind the association between caste and occupation. He had in mind the very stringent rules restricting intermarriage between castes. He had in mind, above all, the rules of ritual inclusion and exclusion. So he was right. But when Srinivas was arguing that caste has been given a new lease of life, he was also right. Finally, let me say one thing, that I came to appreciate the significance of caste in politics in 1961-62, because that is when I was doing my fieldwork in Tanjore district in Tamil Nadu. And 62, the third general elections were held, and I used to move around with my villagers and see how they assessed the chances of various candidates. And I would see that caste was entering as a factor in their calculations, who will win and why is this party setting up this candidate. And when I came to Delhi and talked about this phenomenon with people who were in politics, in fact, if I had more time, I would talk to you about the most fascinating conversation I had with the late E.M.S. Namboodiripad about the role of caste in Indian society. And he, of course, heaped scorn on me for bringing up the importance of caste in Indian politics. That was sometime in the 70s. But when one went into depth with politicians and asked them that, after all, caste is used for mobilizing support in elections, how can you deny it? They would say, the first line, we don't do it, the other parties do it. We don't do it, the other parties do it. And then you point out, you give them evidence and say, but your party also does it. And then they would look pityingly at you and say, you know, Dr. Betaille, this is politics. I'm not a professor like you. We have to be realistic. If other parties are using caste, what do you expect us to do? Okay? So, the use of caste for mobilizing political support was always justified on pragmatic grounds. Like, we have to do it because everybody is doing it. It is here that a change came about in 1977 and in 1990, and this change, I think, is very ominous. The use of caste in politics today is no longer justified only on pragmatic grounds, it is also justified on ideological grounds by an appeal to social justice, quest for justice. You look at the distribution of resources, whether in education or employment, there is no alternative but to use the loyalties of caste for mobilizing political support. And I must say, I may burn my fingers by saying this, that the left parties are no different from other parties in justifying the use of caste in identity politics. So this is where we stand now. Caste has, I don't know, I mean, what is the future? Because when this happens, you know, you would not, of course, people have often pointed out to me that you say that caste has been given a new lease of life by the political process, it's used for mobilizing political support, but if there were nothing to it, how could you use caste for mobilizing political support? I mean, after all, people are conscious to some extent of their caste identity. If they were not conscious of their caste identity at all, how could you use it for mobilizing political support? The point is not that they were not conscious of their caste identity. Of course, they were conscious of it, and this comes up when it comes to marriage. But this consciousness was weakening. In my judgment, this consciousness was weakening. It has been given a new lease of life. It has been strengthened as a result of the kind of identity politics which we have seen in the last, particularly since 1977, but particularly since the Mandal agitations, and now since the push for quotas in central universities and hierarchies. But again, one must, I'll just say one more word, that one must always be very sensitive to regional variations in India. I find it extremely difficult to generalize for the whole of India when I'm talking about the part played by caste in politics or in ritual or in intermarriage for the country as a whole. There are enormous regional variations. There are variations between rural India and urban India, and there are all kinds of variations. But nevertheless, I think it is a very important subject, and I think that my sense is, I may be mistaken, that the Bengali intelligentsia has not taken the importance of caste sufficiently seriously, and I think that they should do that, because I do believe that it is a very important part of the political life of India, at least in the next decade or so. Thank you very much.